you need to continue sharing that message. You need to continue building that community, even if it's just for that one person, because so many times in life, we don't have that opportunity to have that impact or have that influence or have that opportunity to help that one person. So from that perspective, anybody that has a message needs a podcast.
Welcome to the Headsmack Podcast, where we have candid conversations with misfits and mavericks, those not afraid to stand up and stand out, the dreamers and the doers, the ones who've stumbled, fumbled, and then soared. Here we delve into the inspiring journeys and pivotal aha moments that have shaped their worlds. And maybe through sharing their adventures, you'll get hit with a head smack that'll change your destiny. Hey, welcome to the Headsmack Podcast. My name is Povolni. I am excited to have a misfit along for the conversation today. I have Larry Roberts with me. He is the CEO and founder of Red Hat Media, where he brings a wealth of experience as a seasoned content creator and consultant. Larry, so good to have you on, man.
Man, I appreciate the invite. Thanks for having me here. This is awesome.
Well, so Larry, I usually like to start by hearing a little bit about your origin story. For those that don't know you, I want to just hear a little bit about, where you started. You can go as far back as you want, and just share a little bit of the origins of Larry Roberts.
Well, I'll tell you, Paul, it started back August 30th of 1972. That's how far we go back.
The 19th century, yeah.
It's been a minute, but no, in all seriousness, I got into the content game back in 2014 was when I started podcasting. I had heard.
So what were you doing before that?
Well, I was still in corporate America at the time. I was a business intelligence analyst, and
what does that
I was
mean?
with this one company for it's a data guy, just a data nerd is all that means. Is I take massive amounts of data, and we would go through this process called normalizing the data, making the data all uniform. And we'd get this data from a variety of different sources, different customers, different databases, and it would all be formatted completely differently. So in order to use this data, we have to normalize it or make the data look the same. So we would go through that process of normalizing the data. Then we would extract it, transform that data, and then reload it into a database, and then do some, at the end of my career there, we were using AI and some predictive analytics and that sort of thing for forecasting and inventory control and sales projections, you name it, the whole 9 yards. So
you're a little bit of a nerd. You're a little bit of.
I don't think little bit sums it up. No.
So was that your first job out of high school, out of college? Like what was?
No, man. It's been an interesting 51 years. I came right out of high school and I started selling cars, actually. I was supposed to go to the Art Institute of Dallas because I had these delusions of graphic design grandeur. And, my girlfriend at the time, she got pregnant, and that kind of changed the trajectory of everything. And I ended up getting married. And like I said, I started selling cars. I think I was 19 years old when I started selling cars at Red River Chrysler Plymouth Dodge Jeep Eagle in Sherman, Texas.
Nice.
And I thought it was the coolest thing, dude, because I had a business card.
Yeah.
I just knew I don't need college, bro. I got a business card. I'm a professional right now.
You've arrived.
So, but I did that for about we'll say 5 years, 4.5, 5 years, something like that. And then I left selling cars to pursue another delusion of grandeur in the martial arts world. It's funny because before we hit record, you said you had somebody that had to leave the podcast to get to jujitsu. And back in the early 90s, we saw this thing called the Ultimate Fighting Championship hit the United States. It was, I think it was November of 1993. And I was already a martial artist at the time. But man, I saw this stuff and I was like, oh my God, that's what I want to do. I want to learn, because I was a karate guy, but I didn't know how to fight. Yeah. I was like, oh my God, it just transformed everything.
Yeah.
So I literally left the car business and pursued martial arts full time.
Wow.
And
how did you get paid?
Karate school.
Well,
you didn't. I didn't. I didn't.
So you had a wife and a child, and you were pursuing karate.
And I left a well-paying job because I did extremely well in the car business. And like I said, to pursue these delusions of karate guy fighter grandeur.
Yeah.
And I specifically remember, Paul, the first year after I sold cars and was doing this full time, I literally made $2,000
for the whole year.
The whole year.
Oh, wow.
The whole year.
Wow.
The whole year. So yeah, it wasn't a very successful venture in that arena, but It was what I loved. And eventually I did start making some money off of it, but
Yeah.
it was never really enough to make a living at the level that we like to live.
Right.
So I ended up having to get a real job, and I ended up going to work for Texas Instruments. Actually, I just went to work as on the manufacturing line.
Yeah.
I actually worked in a clean room. And if you don't know what a clean room is, you've probably seen the Intel commercials where they have these people in different colored, what look like ninja suits,
Right.
running around and dancing. And in a clean room, that's what you have to wear, because the clean room that I worked in was a class 10. And what that means is that there's only 10 particles, whether it's dust, whether it's skin cells, whether it's whatever, there's only 10 particles for every cubic foot of air.
Wow.
So it's super, super clean. I mean, hundreds of times cleaner than an operating room even.
Wow.
So we would have to go through, we put on our little ninja suit, then we go through an air shower where they blast us with air from every angle. The floors inside the facility actually had holes in the floors because they had what they called laminar airflow going all the time. So air was always flowing from the ceiling to the floor and pushing down any particles that happened to get up. I mean, if we had to sneeze, I'm not kidding, we literally had to kneel down to the floor and sneeze directly into the floor.
Wow.
Yeah, it was insane. It was super clean. So I did that for a while. And I mean, I'm not much of a manufacturing kind of guy. I get bored. And there was an opportunity to be a corporate trainer for TI that opened up. And a couple friends of mine were already trainers at TI. And so I kind of got a little bump there, a little help. And I went and applied for the position, ended up becoming a corporate trainer at Texas Instruments.
So where did that skill set come from to be a corporate trainer?
I'll say everything came from martial arts and from sales, honestly.
Yeah.
Because I had some amazing sales training when I sold cars for those 4 to 5 years that I did that. And in the martial arts side of things, the school where I used to work, the owner of the school, Rick Arnold, who's still a great mentor of mine to this day, would require us to go to Toastmasters to teach karate at his school.
Wow.
So you had to be well-spoken. You had to be able to control a room. You had to be able to control a conversation. You had to be able to speak clearly. And so having those skill sets, being able to sell and carry on a conversation there and control a conversation, and then also my experience at Toastmasters set me up to be a facilitator for TI.
Wow.
And at the same time, I kind of had the inside scoop because I had some friends. So I might have got a little good old boy was in effect there. You know what I mean?
It's amazing how all that stuff kind of worked together to bring you to that point. That's pretty awesome.
Well, I think a lot of people overlook that too.
Yeah.
They overlook their own journeys,
right?
And they overlook the skill sets that they've adopted, regardless of the path that they're on.
Right.
And I think we have to be a little bit older sometimes before we start looking back and going, "Oh, I picked that skill up over there."
Right.
Oh, I worked here and I did this, but that gave me this particular skill.
Absolutely.
That not only was applicable there, but it's applicable later on as well.
Absolutely. And that's why I like starting with that question with folks, is because, a lot of them have kind of got to this place where they've achieved a lot, or they've achieved recognition or authority or whatever in a certain place. But people just see that and they don't understand the journey that got them there, and all those little moments, like with you talked about, well, I did sales, and then I was forced to go to this thing doing karate, and then that led me to this, and then that, and we missed that journey. And I think for the people that listening to the podcast, that's a part of what Headsmack is those aha moments that we could all have in our life where we see, wow, well, I'm kind of here. And now I look back and see how I'm here because of this, this, and this that kind of led me to this place. But that also means that I might not be at the final destination either. And so I love that. So you're doing Toastmasters. Now you're a speaker at Texas Instruments, was it?
Yeah, it was a TI here in Texas. Texas Instruments, everybody knows the calculators.
Right.
But I was a facilitator there for probably 3.5 years or so. And it was back home in Sherman, Texas, which is far north Texas. And I wanted to get down to the big city. I wanted to live in Dallas.
Yeah.
And so I started using my position as a corporate trainer to potentially move up the ladder and be a training manager, ideally in the Dallas space. And I came across this company, and they were supposed to just be a pit stop. They were because they were in Coppell, Texas, which is kind of a suburb, not even kind of, it is a suburb of Dallas. But it's a smaller city. And I thought, well, I'll go to Coppell. I'll do this thing for a couple of years. Then I'll move down to Dallas proper.
Yeah.
And well, that couple of years turned into 21 years, and that's where I was forever. So
Yeah.
I went from being the corporate trainer there. They hired me as a training manager in one of their distribution centers. And I had 6 people that reported to me. They were actually the trainers, and I was over the training. I developed training processes for every process within this distribution center. And eventually they went to implement what is called an ERP system, or an enterprise resource planning system.
Mm-hmm.
And this company it's a global company. But at the time, back in the late 90s, they had facilities all over the globe, but everybody had their own operating system.
Yeah.
And nobody could see what the other satellite companies had in inventory or what their sales were or anything there. And this ERP was designed to bring everybody onto the same page. And they needed somebody to head up the training efforts for that implementation. And they came down, talked to me, and said, would you like to be a part of this? And I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. That'd be amazing. So I got put into the IT department there at this company. And that project lasted for, 16, 17 years.
Wow.
It lasted because they had so many satellite companies literally all over the globe. And we'd do an implementation, then we'd go to another location, do an implementation, and so on and so forth.
Now, you had mentioned early on that you were planning on going to school for graphic art. What happened to that?
Lost.
You totally got
died.
lost. Yeah.
That completely died. The whole creative side of things from that perspective. And it's funny because if you look at and I don't have it on me, obviously, but if you look at my high school class ring, this is how much of a nerd I really am. I didn't have sports on my ring. Usually athletes get their number or whatever it may be. On one side, I had a palette, like a artist palette. Right. So a graphic design on one side, and I had business on the other. So,
wow.
it was straight nerddom the whole way. But but it was cool because once I got into podcasting, I was able to start tapping into that design side of things.
So when did you get into podcasting? Was that while you were in IT? Like what did you do a podcast on while you were in IT?
Yeah, I was actually in IT at the time. I was still at that same company. And I found podcasting in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine that worked in at the company as well. He's like, dude, because he knew I was a fight fan. He knew I watched the UFC. He's like, this Joe Rogan guy, he does the UFC and he has this podcast thing.
Yeah.
And I think you'd really like it if you listened. And I'm like, dude, I don't have time to listen to a podcast. That's for nerds. I'm not doing it. No.
But you were a nerd.
I'm too busy playing video games to listen to a podcast.
And that's not nerdy at all.
So,
yeah.
But I eventually listened.
Yeah.
And when I heard the podcast, it was an episode that featured Tony Hinchcliffe and Joey Diaz. And if you don't know those names, they're very prominent comedians today. And they were pretty popular at the time. Tony right now has just literally blown up. He's doing amazing things. But when they were on there, I heard comedy that took me back to the 80s.
Yeah.
I grew up, even though I grew up without HBO, I still watched HBO because you could still access the channel. You just couldn't really see anything because it was scrambled, but you could hear it just fine. And I used to watch these comedy specials that Mom probably didn't want me watching. But I love me some Sam Kinison and some Dice Clay and some Robin Williams and George Carlin and all the greats from the 80s.
Right.
And I love that style of comedy. And that's what I heard on this podcast. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can tell these jokes on a podcast and not get in trouble. This is the coolest thing ever. So my very first podcast was a comedy podcast.
Yeah. Wow.
I reached out to a friend of mine who was an open mic comic here in the Dallas area. I said, hey, dude, I'm going to start this podcast thing. Do you want to be a part of it? And he's like, yeah, that sounds fun. So he came over to the house. We had one mic. It was a terrible mic. It was a it was a Yeti snowball.
Yeah.
Which it literally looks like a snowball. It's white and it's round, about the size of a softball.
Right.
And we sat in my den. I didn't have a studio at the time or anything. We sat in my den on an ottoman actually, and we would cup that little snowball. I would say what I had to say, and then I would pass it over to Jamie, and he would hold it, and he would say what he had to say, and then he'd pass it back.
That's funny.
And because we thought that this format was so free and we could say anything we wanted,
right?
We did.
Yeah.
And then we listened back to it. We went, oh my God, dude, we can't release this to the public. There is no way we can release this. So we ended up not releasing that first episode, but we learned a lot.
Right.
We dialed it back a little bit and we started the podcast, and it was a comedy podcast. It did extremely well. It did better than any podcast that I've had to date as far as downloads go.
Wow.
And we took it to a live stage show here in North Dallas, and actually Lewisville, Texas. There was a club where we took it to a live stage show, and it evolved into an open mic here in Dallas. And it was literally one of, if not the largest open mic for comedians in all of DFW outside of the comedy clubs.
Wow.
So it was massive. We had people coming every week to these open mics. And that lasted, the show didn't last more than a couple of years because I had to kill it. The name of the show, it was even an innuendo.
Yeah.
And I won't say it on your show, but it was definitely it was an innuendo. Let's just put it that way. And I started getting fans of the show at the office, and they started wearing my merch to work, and it would have the name of the show.
Yeah.
And eventually I got that knock on the door that said, "Hey, why don't we go down to HR and have a little chat?"
Wow.
And they told me, they said, "It's either the show or you. It's one of the two. So make your choice." And at the time, I had no idea what podcasting was, or that there was even an opportunity to turn it into a business.
Yeah.
So I ended up walking away from the show. But at the same time, we still had the open mic. And that mic lasted for about 8 years, 7-8 years, until the club that was hosting it shut down.
And that was your source of income after?
No, I was still in corporate at the time.
Okay,
so that was my source of income. I didn't actually leave corporate until January 4th of 2021.
Okay. So leaving IT nerddom and comedy, which is kind of an interesting mix. What was your next step? Like, what was your next career step? Because you're doing something very different now.
The next career step was, it's 100% what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I started my company in 2017 because what happened was, after I was essentially forced out of my comedy show, I still loved podcasting.
Yeah.
I still loved the relationships that came from podcasting and the opportunity that podcasting presented to talk to people that I would never have the chance to talk to if I didn't have this little podcast show.
Right.
So I started another podcast, and I kept it super, super clean. But at the same time, I had no idea how to market a podcast or brand a podcast or grow a podcast.
Right.
So I started a show. It was a silly name. It was called Readily Random.
Okay.
And it was because I had a blog back in the MySpace days under the same name. It's a silly little blog where I'd write about whatever I wanted. And I thought in the podcast space, I can do the same thing, because I see Joe Rogan do it, right?
Yeah,
He does it. He does it well.
Yeah.
So if he can talk to anybody he wants to, so can I. And I did. I talked to a ton of people, man. I had the opportunity to meet so many super, super cool people.
Yeah.
But no one listened to my show. I'd get 20 downloads, I'd get 30 downloads, and I'd get 50 downloads. And it didn't even matter who the guest was.
Right.
I just couldn't really gather an audience because, let's look at the name. It's called Readily Random. They didn't tell anybody what the show was about. Right. And I'm not a celebrity, so they weren't tuning in for me.
Right.
So there was no reason for anybody to tune into the show.
Right. Because,
as I said before, I didn't really understand the space.
Yeah. Well, and random was just, like, why should I care?
Random.
Like, what value is that going to provide me? Yeah.
100%. So what I ended up doing was, I heard about this podcast conference, and I thought, well, maybe I need to go to this conference and see what this podcast stuff is all about. And I went to my first podcast conference. It was called Podcast Movement. And I went to Podcast Movement and started realizing, oh my gosh, this podcast thing, this is a business.
Yeah.
This is an opportunity for a business just like anything else. And as I started to learn more about the industry, I started getting more and more involved in the industry. Then I started speaking in the industry, and then my podcasting career just kind of exploded from there.
So what were you speaking on?
Well, I was speaking on how to grow an audience, how to speaking on creativity. I was speaking on just the basics, very early level basics of podcasting. And that started opening up stages for me to speak on other topics as well.
Yeah.
And I started learning more about the industry and learning more about content creation and podcasting and the ins and outs of podcasting. And over the course of several years, I started establishing myself as an individual in the podcast space.
Yeah, yeah.
And about 3 years ago, also in 2021, the Red Hat was born. And when the Red Hat was born, it changed everything.
So tell me a little bit about...
Now I also had a brand.
All right, so I do want to talk about that. But I also want to talk about, you mentioned, the things that you learned in failing at a podcast, and you started doing some learning about a podcast, and now you started helping others with podcasts. And so for the person that's listening to this, and maybe they're like, this podcasting thing, like everybody's talking about it. I'm really interested in it. Paul's now doing one, I mean, this is, only a few weeks old for me. And so, it's fairly new. I just felt an unavoidable, unignorable urge to do it. And so I did it, launched it in 2 weeks and just went for it. So
awesome.
For somebody else I didn't do a whole lot of research beforehand. Like I was like, I want to do a podcast. I'm going to do a podcast, researched a couple of tools and some tech stacks and some equipment and just like went for it. Totally wrong way, but I did it. Like I got myself out of the urge to make it perfect, the urge to say, one day I'll do it. I just kind of like set a deadline and said, I'm doing it. And I did it.
Yeah.
So for somebody else that is wanting to do a podcast, first of all, who shouldn't do a podcast? And secondly, who should?
It's funny because just the other day, I actually made this statement because I've always said that everybody needs a podcast. But I had listened to a podcast the other day that was so just not on point, where I was actually talking to a business partner of mine. I go, look, Sarah, I don't.
I think I need to change that bullet point.
I don't think everybody needs a podcast. But, I say that somewhat jokingly because, during the COVID era, especially, we saw so many new podcasts.
Right.
I mean, the podcast space exploded because what else are we going to do? We're trapped indoors. We want that connectivity. We want that community. And one of the easiest ways to do that is by starting a podcast.
Right.
So in all honesty, I still believe that anybody can have a podcast. Sometimes as creators, and I'm speaking for myself here, we get tunnel vision.
Yeah.
And we think that it has to be this way. It has to have this approach. It has to have this quality. It has to have this, you have to have all these steps.
Right.
Or it's not worth doing.
Right.
And it's just not true. It's just not true. And so I kind of got caught up in my own fallacy there for a bit, thinking that there's nobody. Everybody needs a podcast, honestly, because if you have something to say, if you have a message, and if you have one person that is listening to that message and you're impacting that one person, then by all means, you need to continue doing that show. You need to continue sharing that message. You need to continue building that community, even if it's just for that one person, because so many times in life, we don't have that opportunity to have that impact or have that influence or have that opportunity to help that one person. So from that perspective, anybody that has a message needs a podcast.
So so somebody says, well, I'm kind of introverted, or I'm not really good at just kind of talking off the cuff. What are some different types of podcasts that could maybe encourage somebody and say, oh, I hadn't thought about doing that kind of a podcast? What are some that you've seen out there that people do that might not necessarily be just them talking?
Well, one of the easiest things for me, at least, was having a co-host.
Yeah.
Having a co-host makes a podcast so much easier because you just bounce everything off of each other.
Yeah.
And odds are it's a friend of yours or it's someone that you know really, really well. So you're already comfortable having those conversations. So having a co-host is super, super easy for a podcast.
Yeah.
Now, if you're doing a solo podcast where it's just me and this camera that's staring at me right now, and I'm trying to talk to the camera and talk to the audience, dude, that is super intimidating and super hard.
And painful.
So I would highly recommend that if you're going to start a podcast, try to have a friend.
Yeah.
Get a friend with you, do a co-host type show.
Right. Especially, and I would think that having that friend that is maybe a little opposite to you or different, kind of like a almost an Abbott and Costello or Jerry Lewis and Dean, like some where you could play off of each other's strengths.
Sure.
I think that certainly is something to consider. Is where are they strong that you're weak? Where are you strong that they're weak? And that also brings a dynamic that I think would also help with that. Certainly, but not necessarily the only way.
No, definitely not the only way by any stretch of the imagination. There's also a cautionary tale there as well, because you may have one idea of where you want to take this show, and the co-host may not be quite as committed to that same goal that you particularly have. So you want to make sure that you're definitely in alignment before you go down that path. But regardless, I mean, there's so many different opportunities for podcasts. You can do a solo show like I was just talking about, a little more difficult because it feels a little cheesy if you're not used to staring at a camera and having a conversation. My wife, she literally sits on the other side of my studio wall. That's where she hangs out. That's our den.
Yeah.
So when I first started getting on camera and I was doing solo shows, I just knew that she's in there just on the other, because she can hear me. I'm loud, right? I knew she was sitting in there in her chair, just hanging out and just snickering, going, "Oh, look at Larry. He's doing a little podcast
Is
thing."
that cute?
So exactly. Isn't that special? So it could be a little intimidating to do that. But I think the more you put yourself out there, the more you commit to doing a podcast, the more you just hit record or go live or whatever it may be. That's going to make you more and more comfortable, and it's going to contribute to more of your conversations outside of the podcast space. You're going to be more confident when you meet someone. You're going to be more confident in networking scenarios. You're going to be more confident if you have that opportunity to present from stage. So it's a great training tool, and it's a great developmental tool, regardless of what profession you're in or industry you're in or anything like that.
What are some other types of podcasts? You mentioned having a co-host. You mentioned doing it solo. And I think even within the solo space, there's different variations of that. Some of it is you're topical, you do a bunch of research, you share your research. It's not even necessarily your knowledge. It's you're the translator of all this information about a certain topic. And so if you have something on, a certain type of breed of cat or dog or gardening or whatever it might be, you do the research and then you bring it to the podcast and you share the research. Others is stuff that like internal knowledge, I would imagine, like if you're doing a solo type thing. What are some other types of podcasts that people can consider?
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in a variety of different perspectives there. When I first got started going live, because live podcasts are amazing, I did a thing called 10 Minutes In. And I actually named it that. And my whole goal was to just go live on Facebook and get 10 minutes. I just wanted to do 10 minutes every day. So my goal was to get 10 minutes in every day. And during that time, I took a deck of inspirational cards. And for every episode, I took one of those cards out. We read the card, and then we applied it to our lives and talked about how we could apply it to our audience's lives as well. And when I first got started, man, if you've ever gone live on Facebook, if you look up in that top left-hand corner, you can see how many people are watching. And for days, if not weeks and weeks, I would look up and guess what I would see? Zero. Goose egg. Nobody's watching. But I kept showing up. I kept doing it. And before you know it, I had 5 people. I had 10 people. And I ended up doing this for about 7 months, doing this 10 minutes in thing, 6, 7 months, something like that. And by the end, I had 100 plus people watching every live feed because I went on live every day at the exact same time. And I did it just so that I could develop as a content creator, so that I could get comfortable in front of my camera.
That's so good.
And that's a great way for anybody that's out there to start whatever kind of podcast they want. And, we're talking about the different types of podcasts, but there's really no limit to the type of podcast that's out there. Because really it boils down to, how can you deliver value? How can you deliver content that someone finds valuable on a consistent basis?
That's good.
And that's really it. So if you can do it by yourself, great. If you can do it with a co-host, great. If you can do it doing interviews like we're doing right now, and I love that. If you don't have a co-host, an interview podcast is an amazing way to start getting comfortable. And man, I'm telling you, even on that podcast that had 0 traction, readily random, I still met so many cool people. I mean, Mark Victor Hansen, author of Chicken Soup for the Soul, if not the greatest bestseller of all time. I had him on my show because why? Because I had a podcast. And then Mark ended up becoming an associate. I won't call him a friend, but an associate. And he connected me with the saxophone player from Pink Floyd. My favorite band of all time. So because I met Mark Victor Hansen on my podcast, I got to meet a real live member of my favorite band of all time. Now, did many people, not that many people listened, a few hundred people listened to the episode, but who cares? I had the opportunity to meet a hero of mine, somebody that I worshiped since I was a sophomore in high school, And it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the podcast. And that's just one example. I mean, I've met NFL Hall of Famers. I've met other massive influencers. I've met other people that have made tremendous impacts in a variety of different industries. And it's all because I just had a podcast. So if you're out there and you want to have these conversations, the podcast or a podcast is, if it's the best way to do it. Because it just provides that opportunity to open up the avenue of conversation that's just not there anyplace else.
I love that. And you're absolutely right. There are an endless amount of types of podcasts. The having a co-host, doing it solo, like we said, doing research, talking about what's in your head, just like you shared about the 10 minutes in, is just finding something inspirational, whether it's an inspirational quote, a leadership quote, a scripture, whatever it might be, and just talking about, here's my thoughts on that, here's what I think about that, is another form. And there are endless kinds of forms, and there might even be forms that you might be the first person to do it. Like, you might be the one that says, hey, I'm going to do a podcast like this. And it's like, well, nobody else is doing it. It's like, so what? Do it. Because, one thing that I've always said is everybody wants to be innovative until they're asked to be first, and so, if there's some sort of a format that you're like, well, will anybody care? It's like, give it a shot. Like, go all in, give it a good go. Like, some people, they go in haphazardly and half-hearted, and then they're like, well, it kind of failed. Nobody wanted it. Well, no, go all in. Go really hard in and give it time. And so I've heard that podcast usually lasts about 13 episodes, right? And then people kind of jump ship. And
it's not even that, honestly. It's not even. It's around seven episodes is about the industry average. And I think right now, because we're coming out of the COVID creator phase, it's even shorter, 3 to 5 episodes, and people go, I'm out. And if you go to listennotes.com, you'll see all these podcasts that are out there.
Yeah.
They say there's 4 million podcasts if you go to listennotes.com.
Wow.
And most of those, they're not active.
Yeah.
And what happens is people start these podcasts and they live on. They're kind of evergreen, right?
Right.
But they're not producing any new content.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go look at my last podcast, I have a podcast now that's called Branded, and we're currently producing content. But if you go look at my prior podcast called You're the Boss, it's still out there. Yeah. And I think it's actually still in the top 1.5% of all podcasts. Right. But I haven't released an episode in like 2 years.
Wow.
So that's what you have to take into consideration, because it can be intimidating. You go, oh, everybody has a podcast. No, I promise you, everybody doesn't have a podcast. They may have started a podcast, but they probably still don't have it.
Well, yeah, I recently actually went through my phone and looked at all the podcasts that I subscribed to, and I didn't realize how many of them that first of all, I didn't listen to them, but secondly, how many of them are like dead? Like, it was an amazing list of people that I was just like deleting these because it's like dead, like they haven't done anything in a long time. So for the ones that you've seen that have kept going, that have gone beyond the 13, the 1 year or whatever, what are some of the things that you've seen in them that keeps them going? Like, what's been the biggest thing that you've seen that keeps people moving and doing podcasts?
I think it's the evolution of the impact of their show.
Yeah.
And we typically say that, man, you don't even really get started until you've done 100 episodes.
Yeah. Wow.
You don't really understand the creation process till you've hit that 100th episode.
Yeah.
Because you're going to evolve so much. You're going to evolve on the mic. You're going to evolve on camera. You're going to go from scripted and stiff back and trying to deliver it as good as possible. And here I'm being very no, you're not. You're not casual.
Yeah.
You're not going to relax in front of that camera. You're not going to relax on that microphone till you have some experience.
Right.
And it's that way in everything that we do in life. And it's no different here in front of a microphone or on a microphone and on a camera. So get 100 episodes in.
Yeah.
Evaluate where you're at after that.
Right.
Look at your audience. Go, okay, I'm still only getting 20 downloads per episode. Not really making a huge impact. I've done 100 episodes. What am I doing wrong?
Right.
And odds are there's probably something there that we could tweak.
Yeah.
We could change. It might be something small.
Right.
It may be the smallest thing. But after 100 episodes, you got to give it that. You got to give it that 100.
Yeah.
And then you can start evaluating and actually start considering how you're creating your content and the message you're delivering. And maybe you need to deliver it a little bit different to make the impact that you're looking to make. But yeah, man, 100 episodes.
Yeah. So you mentioned 20 quite a few times. Is that what you're seeing an average for most people's downloads? Or is that like really bad?
Oh, as far as downloads go,
yeah,
I see that often. Yes, okay. I do. Because one of the things that I do is I do podcast audits on a regular basis. Yeah. So people come to me, they go, hey man, take a look at my show. Please tell me, where I'm at compared to industry standards. And so I dig deep into these shows, and 20 to 50 downloads is pretty common per episode.
I think that's encouraging for somebody.
Average,
I think for somebody.
I think so too, dude. Because listen, if I stand in a room and there's 50 people in this room and I'm talking to 50 people, if you've never been on stage and you've never stood in front of 50 people, you go, that doesn't sound like a lot. I promise you, if you stand in front of 50 people, your insides are going to be, they're going to be in turmoil.
Yeah.
You're going to be like, oh my God, I'm in front of 50 people.
Yeah.
But we don't use that perspective
Right.
when it comes to our podcast.
That's so good.
Because we hear about Joe Rogan and all these other podcasts that get tens of thousands, if not millions of downloads per episode. Well, we don't take into account what these other people were doing to get those downloads.
Right.
You know, they have a marketing budget to help get those downloads. They advertise to get those downloads. Joe Rogan literally sells out stadiums.
Right.
So you go to watch a football game in a stadium. He's one person that sells that stadium out for his comedy.
Right. Right.
So if you take that and you go, okay, well, I speak at my local Rotary to 12 people. So, okay, well, let's keep it in perspective.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I love that.
So, and that's what we have a hard time realizing is that we haven't necessarily earned the right to do some of the things that some of these bigger creators are already doing. So we have to do that work. We have to put in that lower level work, get those 100 episodes in, figure out what we're doing, figure out how we're doing it. Then we can start growing from there. But yeah, very common. Again, industry standard right now. On average, the average podcast pulls in about 125 downloads per episode.
Wow.
So yeah, keep your expectations in check. We all have delusions of grandeur. We all see all this on Instagram and Facebook and all these platforms where everybody's crushing it.
Yeah.
Well, I promise you, if you're doing 25 downloads per episode, you're crushing.
I love that perspective. I think for somebody that's listening to this, that's a Headsmack moment for them because, you know, they've launched their podcast or they're thinking about launching a podcast and they have these expectations of what it's going to be like. Yeah, I'm going to be hitting thousands and like I'm going to be the next Joe Rogan. And I think a lot of podcasts probably fade away because they're not getting the audience that they came into it expecting. And so knowing that average, that 20 to 100 is average per episode for most podcasts. I think for somebody that's been a huge head smack. Like that's been incredible. But for the person that wants to grow their audience, that it's like, yeah, that's cool, but I feel I have a message that I want more people to hear. Or like you said, you had famous people on your podcast, but you weren't getting the download. So what changed? Like how do you get it to get more downloads and more out there?
You know, I think I took probably a different route than most would take because I started speaking and I started getting on stages and I started being involved in the industry and I started building a brand around the industry. So I think the key there, though, is building a brand.
Yeah.
And I actually went to a networking organization this morning. It's called Success North Dallas. And the speaker, she was all talking about building a strong personal brand. And that's really what you have to do. You have to find something that's a differentiator and you have to develop what I call a unique listening proposition for your show.
Nice.
Why are people going to listen to you as compared to anybody else?
Yeah.
So if somebody was to tune into Readily Random, why would they tune into that show? They have no idea.
Right.
The name is stupid.
Right.
You know, they don't know what it's about. They don't know my name. I had no brand.
Yeah.
And believe me, I went through brand after brand after brand after brand after brand until the red hat actually hit.
Yeah.
And it actually established me as a brand in the space. And it was an accident. Yeah. And I think a lot of times our brands are accidents.
Yeah.
And we realize, oh my God, that's my differentiator. That's what makes me so different. And we can't see it here on Riverside because the way it frames, but behind me, there's a hat back here. It's a Supreme hat. Yeah. And Supreme it's a lifestyle brand. And everything that they do is red. And it just says Supreme in big bold letters across the front of their merchandise, whatever it is. Yeah. And I wore that hat on stage at the Emily Arena in Tampa, Florida. I was doing a talk, and I had that hat on, and now it's in a trophy case actually because it's really changed everything.
A turning point, head smack moment, right?
100% head smack moment, and it was on my head, so that's even better. But I came down off stage, and a friend of mine, he goes, "Hey man, good talk, blah blah blah, but why are you wearing that Supreme hat?" And I was like, well, it's a younger audience. I'm a little older. I'm just trying to be cool, trying to be hip, whatever. He goes, all right, cool. But are they paying you? And I went, no, they're not paying me. He goes, then why are you wearing their merch on stage?
Wow.
So I was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. But he goes, hey, I tell you what, though, I do love the red because I'm about 6'3" and I weigh about 240 pounds. I'm a big guy, tall guy. He goes, but that red hat, he goes, I could literally see you across the arena and I knew it was you. So after he said that, I went home and I was thinking about it. I was like, man, okay, I dig that. They're not going to pay me. I'm a 50-year-old white male. They'd probably pay me not to wear their stuff.
You're the wrong brand ambassador. Yeah,
yeah,
let's
I'm
stop that.
completely opposite from their demographic. They're like, bro, stop. Yeah, get out of here. So what I ended up doing was I took that Supreme hat, tossed it to the side, and I went on Amazon and I bought a $6 unbranded, flat billed red hat, and I tossed it on, tilted it 5 degrees to the right. And before you knew it, dude, I was the red hat guy in the podcast space.
Nice.
I'd go to conferences, people recognize, they don't know my name, or they didn't at least then, but they knew the red hat guy, and they knew the red hat guy knew about podcasting. Yeah. So I was already establishing that brand. And I'll tell you when it really hit was about 5 months later. I went to Bitcoin Miami, which is a massive Bitcoin conference. 30,000+ people are in attendance over the span of about 3 days. And during that time, I was there as a podcaster, creating content, interviewing some of the speakers. And multiple people walked up to me and went, "Oh, hey, are you the podcast guy?"
Wow.
And I was like, "Well, yeah, how do you know that?" And they go, "Well, the red hat."
Wow.
And I was like, "Oh my God, this is insane."
It's working, yeah.
So people I don't know are recognizing me because of this hat. So that's when I went in, I changed my business name. Everything became Red Hat Media, and I've been the Red Hat guy ever since.
Absolutely love that. And I think there's several things that you've shared there that I think are super valuable. For one thing, about the podcast, I think we with the podcast, you had the random podcast, didn't have anything that what anybody would be interested in. There was no promise in the name. There was no expectation in the name. There was no hook in the name. And so I think that was super valuable. And you shared, like, when it comes to your podcast, you've got to have a hook. You've got to have a promise. You've got to have something about it that somebody, when scrolling, trying to find a new podcast, or even sharing about it or telling somebody else about it, there's something about it that makes sense. Like, how would you recommend a random podcast? Like, there's no selling point to it. Like,
you can't.
What are my expectations? Like, what are they going to be talking about? And so I think that was powerful in what that insight that you shared there is you've got to have a hook. You've got to have some promise or something about your podcast that somebody would say, yeah, I've got to listen to that. The second thing you talked about is your personal brand. And I think that's powerful, the adopting of the red hat. And I think owning another sort of hook when it comes to your brand. And, I help brands. I help brands differentiate. And usually, it starts by looking at the brandscape. Like, who else is in your space? Whether a competitor or aspirational, that's the brandscape, looking kind of out and seeing, okay, here's competitors, here's aspirational, and where do I sit in that? And do I differentiate enough to stand out? And so you've got to look, when it comes to even your personal brand, what can you do that becomes your personal brand? And, one thing I've said is, if somebody was to dress like you for Halloween, what would they wear? And most people, like, nobody could dress like them for Halloween. Like, if they were trying to make fun of you on Saturday Night Live, what would they dress like? Well, for most people, they can't do that. There's nothing about them as a personal brand that differentiates them. So I love that you've adopted that red hat, and that's kind of become your thing. What are some other things that people should consider when it comes to their personal brand?
Well, they need to understand too that even this red hat, it's just an identifier. It's just kind of a logo. Yeah. Because it's everything that's under the red hat that's actually the brand. Right. It's how you follow through on your brand promise. It's how you interact with your customers. It's how you lift others up. It's how you give back to your community. So it's all about, really, for me personally, what's under the red hat. And I'm going to do a cheesy plug right now. That's why my book is called Under the Red Hat. Strategies to stand out in a crowded marketplace. Yeah. So it's all about being under the red hat. And it's the same thing for your brand. You know what I mean? It's all about, how does that brand resonate with your community? Right. And your community, I don't mean your neighborhood. I don't necessarily mean the city you live in, but I mean your community of ideal customers, or from a podcast perspective, your ideal listeners. Right. So it's how does that brand resonate with that community? Yeah. And I think that's what so many people lose sight of as well. Right. When I do brand consulting, people go, well, what can I wear? Yeah. And I'm like, it's not necessarily about what you wear. Right. Granted, I love your analogy, Paul, of how if someone was to dress up for you as Halloween, how would they do that? But there's a variety of ways that you could do that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a clothing item. And a lot of times when I work with people, they're like, well, you wear a red hat. What if I wear a blue hat? Probably not going to work as well. Right. Because it's not you. It's not who you are. Right. It's everything that you are. It's everything that I am that's under this hat. This hat just makes me stand out in a crowd. Right. it gives me that initial attention that so many of us are lacking. It's that thing that starts the conversation, but then it's up to me to deliver the brand promise of continually building brand storytelling through leveraging podcasting and branding and artificial intelligence. That's what we do at my company and that's what I have to convey in my messaging. So that's the biggest thing. Don't get so caught up in the identifier. Get caught up in the value proposition that's under that identifier.
I love that. Well, it's kind of like saying I have a brand, or I have branding because I have a logo. And it's the same kind of thing. Your logo is such a small part of it. And, often when it comes to defining, brand and branding, people have a misconception of what the two are. Now, do you have the way you define branding and brand and the difference between them?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry. I was coughing and I muted myself, so I didn't hear the question.
How do you differentiate? We talked about the logo. People think that they have a logo, they have a brand, but how do you differentiate when you talk to people about the difference between having a brand and branding?
Well, the difference between having a brand and branding is it's attention getting, and then it's fulfillment of the brand promise. So you want to have that logo, that brand, and you want to get that attention. And how do you do that? So from my perspective, that's what branding is. How do I get that attention? How do I get that initial conversation? How do I initiate that new relationship with a potential client or a potential collaborator or whoever it may be? But then the branding is the follow through. It's following through on that promise. It's developing that client. It's developing that collaboration. It's developing that effort on the back end. And that's the two biggest differences there.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with that. Is a lot of people think, like we said, the red hat, that's my brand. That's who I am. And everything under the hat is what actually is a part of your brand and branding. And, for me, a brand is basically your reputation. It's what people think and feel about what you say and do, right? And then branding is activity. It's everything you say and do, And so
your brand is what people say about you behind your back.
Right.
That's your brand.
Right.
That's your brand.
Right. And branding is, like you said, everything under the hat. It's everything that you say and do. It's your reputation. It's your promise. It's your fulfillment. It's the way your office looks, the way your office smells. I mean, it's the way people answer phones. It's all of that stuff is to do with your branding. And so saying that your brand is your red hat is accurate. And so you wrote a book about it, but it's also like saying, well, I have a logo, therefore I have branding, therefore that's all I need. I'm good. I think there's a lot more to consider when it comes to that space. And so one of the lessons when you're dealing with somebody that, and we've moved from podcasting to branding, and we'll talk a little bit about AI as well. When it comes to building a brand, and for the person that says, well, I'm going to do a blue hat, sure, do a blue hat. But what are some of the other things that you talk to them about and say, here's some, and you mentioned some of them already, but I want to make sure we kind of dive a little deeper into that.
Sure.
Because it is such a, in 2024, it's super competitive. The world is accessible to everybody. Everybody's getting into certain spaces. So what are some other things that you like, the first tools, the first things that a brand needs to consider when it comes to creating something that's going to last?
Well, I think the biggest thing is standing out, because as you just said, it's such a crowded market space. Everybody has a podcast. Everybody's creating reels. Everybody's creating TikToks. Everybody has something to say. But what they're saying, is it of value?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I'm seeing, and I believe this wholeheartedly, what I'm seeing, especially these days, is that a lot of people are desperate for community.
Yeah.
So is your brand doing something to build a community around that brand? Because you're really only as strong as your biggest fans.
Yeah.
If you look at, take soft drinks, take Coca-Cola and Pepsi, you're not going to convert a Pepsi drinker to be a Coke drinker, and vice versa.
Right.
So they've built just the most committed fans. They love their products. And some of these Coke people, they have Coke everything. Some of these Pepsi people, they have Pepsi everything. But you're never going to convert those. So what can you do as a brand to build these super fans?
Right.
And the biggest thing, man, is really just giving. And so many times people want to establish a brand and they want to start getting. They go, well, if I have a brand, I'll make a lot of money and I'll be an influencer and people will come to me and they'll pay me. No, they won't. No, I promise they won't. I promise they won't, because I've had that conversation with the wife when she came knocking on my office door going, hey, bro, this you left that 6-figure career to do this podcast thing. and it's not quite working out the way you said it was going to work
Yeah.
out. Now, today it's working out a lot better, but we had that conversation in that first year. And it's because I didn't understand the value of giving, the value of building that brand and establishing that brand promise and letting people know that if they work with you, they're getting this, and this. They're not just going to get a red hat to wear. They're going to get a red hat. They're going to get support 24/7. They're going to have access to me. They're going to have me doing everything I can to research what they're trying. I'm going to be there for them. My team is going to be there for them, and we're going to lift them up and we're going to support them. So it's understanding that. And I think that's a huge contributing factor to why I went through so many brands.
Yeah.
From 2014 to 2021, when I left corporate as the red hat guy, man, I went through at least a half a dozen brands. I went through Podcast Boost. I went through Readily Random. I went through, God, there's One Big Win. I went through brand after brand after brand after brand. And my wife has literally every business card in her office right now of all the different business cards that I made for all these different brands. But I didn't really understand what that meant because I was still flying blind, thinking that if I just had this really cool brand, people were going to resonate with it and come to me, but they're not. They don't care.
So what changed?
They don't care if you have a little rocket logo. Yeah. So what changed was I realized that I went, oh my God, I had that conversation. That's exactly what changed, honestly. So I left corporate in 2021, January 4th of 2021. Long about August of 2021, my wife came to me and she knocked on the studio door right there, that door right there. She goes, hey, let's have a chat. Things weren't working out the way that I told her they were going to work out. The business plan wasn't quite coming to fruition. So I had to look at it and evaluate why.
Right.
And I had to dig deep, and I have several mentors. I still have several mentors today, several coaches. And I started asking them, what am I doing wrong? And the consensus was I was relying too much on a brand that didn't exist. So I had a logo, I had a brand, but nobody knew what it was. It meant nothing to anybody other than me.
Yeah.
And, that's a mistake that a lot of new podcasters make too, is they make a podcast, they give it some fancy name that doesn't resonate with anyone other than themselves.
Right.
So it doesn't mean anything to anybody. So like what same thing. So I was doing the same thing with a brand. So I had to step back and go, okay, well, I'm going to go this route and I'm going to start talking about this. I'm going to start getting on stages. I'm going to start interacting with people. I'm going to start networking and I'm going to start building this brand.
Yeah.
And that's what worked out, man. It really, I had to go back and I had to do a lot of legwork. I had to shake hands. I had to show up. Luckily enough, I was able to get on some virtual stages at the time. Those virtual stages turned into live stages and I put myself out there.
Yeah.
And I committed myself to being at the forefront of my brand and representing my brand and representing exactly what you as a consumer are going to get if you were to work with my brand. And I started establishing myself as a thought leader and people started recognizing me. I started showing up everywhere. Everybody's like, oh my God, you're traveling all the time. I do. I invested a ton of money over the last 3 to 5 years on traveling, paying my own way to speak on stages for the low price of freaking free to get my brand out there, man. And that's what it took. It took that effort. It took that legwork. And it took showing up consistently and demonstrating the values that were under the red hat before people started believing
So
in it.
you had this wall of business cards and you had this coach that challenged you. What was the deciding factor, or what were the things that prompted this Headsmack moment of deciding what your brand was? Like, what did your brand become at that moment? The wall of business cards, and now your brand is this. What was the deciding factor? What was the moment that changed everything?
I belong to several masterminds, 2 specifically at the moment. And one of the masterminds specifically had several of my friends. I mean, what I consider close friends in this mastermind. They're also in the podcast industry. And I was in the hot seat one day. And I was which means that you're in the middle. Everybody's looking at your business plan. They're looking at your brand. They're looking at everything you do. And they're basically attacking you.
Wow. Shooting at it. Yeah.
You're doing this wrong. You're doing this wrong.
Wow.
It's coming from everywhere, right? And so many of my close friends, because this is a raw moment.
Yeah.
You let all the friendship go. This is just, you're in the hot seat and they're coming at you.
Vulnerable,
Okay?
man.
Answer these questions. Yeah, super vulnerable. And they went, hey, man. And this was, I don't know, 3 or 4 different people said, I have no idea what you do.
Wow.
And I'm like, what do you mean you don't know what I do? We freaking go to the same conferences. We all do the same thing. No, what do you do, Larry?
Wow.
And after hearing that, my feelings were hurt, and I might have boohooed a little bit,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I had to retreat a little bit, lick my
Yeah.
wounds, and then I was like, okay, I need to clearly define exactly what I
Wow.
do, and that's when I came back and I said, okay, cool. I do podcasting, I do branding, and I do AI.
Yeah.
Those are my three tenets of my
Yeah.
brand. Those are what we specialize in at Red Hat Media. So that was the biggest moment, was being in that hot seat. And it was devastating. It was hurtful, but it was constructive. It wasn't intentionally. They weren't out to hurt me in any way, shape or form, but it still hurt
Right.
me, because I thought I was the cat daddy and I thought I was doing all this stuff right.
Right.
And they went, no, bro, you're doing it
Yeah.
all wrong.
Yeah.
And when you hear that from people that you respect, that you look at and go, oh, they're already crushing it, and they tell you that, you go, okay, cool.
Right.
So the head smack moment was when I surrounded myself with other like-minded professionals in my industry and got raw, unfiltered feedback from them about what I was doing.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah, I recently was coaching somebody, and they were, in their 50s, in a career transition, trying to figure out, what are they going to do next? And they sent me all the stuff that they did. And it was like all over the place, like the wealth of experience. And the question was, well, if I was to recommend you to somebody, what do I tell them?
Yeah.
And I think that's where you were, like you're in that same place. So if I was to recommend you, Larry, like, what do I tell people? Like, what do you do? And so I think that's a super head smack moment for somebody right now, is like, if I was to recommend you, what would I tell people? And if that's not clear, you've got some homework to do. Like, you've got to sit down and you've got to figure out what you're going to do and then go all in on that. And so I think that happened with you. You decided that podcasting was it, branding was it, generative AI was it. And then you just went all in, like, this is what I do. And I think I've kind of come to a moment like that as well. I love podcasting. I've only been doing it for a short time. And I feel like, man, I love podcasting. Like, I really, really love talking to people. And then just, I help people with brands as well. I help people get brand clarity so they stand out in their space. And so now that I've come to that, like, I'm like, okay, that's all I'm going to talk about from now on. Like, I've talked about a lot of stuff, but I'm going to start talking about that. So I think that's a powerful moment. So let's talk about generative AI. They seem, podcasting, branding, generative AI. How does that tie in all together to who you are and what you do?
Well, I kind of fell into the AI space, in all honesty, because when we were talking about this earlier on, I got introduced to AI when I was still in corporate with predictive analytics and business intelligence, that sort of thing. So I didn't just jump on the bandwagon in November of 22 when ChatGPT came on the scene. I'd already been familiar, on a very high level with AI and some of the promises that AI brings to the forefront. But when ChatGPT hit, I was lucky enough, it hit late November of 22. And in January of 23, I was able to do a talk on ChatGPT at a large podcast conference called Podfest. And there were 400 or 500 people in the room at the time. Biggest talk I'd ever done. It was scary as all get out, to be honest with you. But it went over very well. And there were a ton of people in the audience that opened up other doors. So I kind of fell into being the AI guy in the podcast space because of that in particular talk. But as such, I just embraced it, man. And I've been absorbed with AI ever since, especially from a generative perspective. When it came out, when ChatGPT hit, I saw what could streamline content creation for so many people. Because that's one of the biggest things. We talked about what we call pod fade in the industry, where people start a podcast and they're gone 3 to 7 episodes in. We call that pod fading. So one of the reasons for pod fade is because people start a podcast and they realize, oh my God, this is like a part-time job.
Yeah.
Because I have to schedule, I have to interview, I have to edit, I have to promote, I have to do all this stuff. So there's a ton of post conversation that goes on when you have a podcast.
Tell me about it.
And a lot of people hate that back end because I, for one, am one of those people. I hate editing. I hate it all. I hate all that. I just like having the conversations and meeting people and developing relationships. That's what I love about podcasting. But that back end, man, that's just not my game. And I saw what generative AI could do to streamline that game. And I was blown away when it comes to, using ChatGPT to plan episodes, to build out a content calendar, to build out quotes from particular episodes, to transcribe the episodes and summarize the episodes into blog posts, into social media posts, and even generate images that go along. I mean, just you name it, one thing after another. It just built and built and built. And I saw all of the potential with generative AI that came on the scene. And then we started seeing developers step up, and they were developing specific platforms with AI integrated into these platforms to make content creation even easier, whether it's Capshow or Cast Magic or Video.ai or Opus Clips or all these platforms that are out there right now that are using AI to streamline our processes. And I just immersed myself in those platforms, found out which platforms I thought were the most beneficial. It's kind of opinion based there, but saw the potential in some of these platforms, and I started talking about them. And at my core, I'm a ChatGPT guy. I love ChatGPT. I got heavily involved into persona modeling, making ChatGPT sound more like you. Got big into prompt engineering because with my programming background, not that I'm a programmer, but I can write a little bit of code, but just engineering from that perspective, I was really brought into the prompt engineering side of things to help people use prompts to get the results that they're looking for. Because if you've ever used one of these chatbots, you realize that if you don't quite prompt it right, you're not going to get the results that you're looking for. So, and then I just fell into things, man. I had the opportunity to be on ABC here in the Dallas-Fort Worth market. And now I've become essentially a regular on Good Morning Texas, which is a show here in the Dallas-Fort Worth market, talking about AI and how AI is impacting a variety of perspectives of our lives, whether it's our careers or whether it's our children's education. I work with the State Board of Education here in the state of Texas, talking about how we implement AI into the curriculum. So it just exploded, and AI became a focal point of everything that I do. And I think it was because I love it, for starters, and I had a little bit of knowledge in the space, and I had a strong personal brand. So the personal brand helped me really stand out when, everybody's talking about AI. But why does Larry, why am I getting these opportunities to speak on AI in some of these larger venues? It's because I have a strong brand.
So when it comes to AI, what are some of the things that you're excited about for the future of it? What are some things that really like have you buzzed?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you right now, it's hard not to be buzzed. Google just had a slew of new announcements for their Gemini platform. So there's tons of new stuff coming out there. Monday, the day before, OpenAI just released the latest version of ChatGPT, and it has functionality that is literally mind-blowing, especially from a verbal perspective, man. And we just keep seeing these jumps in the technology and what it can do. So what am I excited about, man? I'm excited about what's next. And the thing is, we just don't know. We don't, I mean, for Christ's sake, 2 weeks ago, they released a robot AI empowered flamethrowing dog that you can buy for less than $10,000, $9,400. You can get your own robot dog with a flamethrower.
Not terrifying at all.
So no, not at all. And it's so funny because my wife and I were just talking last night, and, we're seeing all these insane advancements. And with what happened on Monday with ChatGPT releasing their new version, the new version of ChatGPT just put out of business an entire industry that was based on their previous version of ChatGPT, because now the functionality's in this release and it's free to everybody. So all these platforms that were built up to provide this functionality, ChatGPT literally just turned around and said, you're out of business. Now we're doing this for free. So what's next? That's what's got me excited. You never know what's next.
And I think that's the dangerous thing of sometimes building what you do on somebody else's technology, because it happens with even Apple products and Adobe products and, all the stuff that we use on a regular basis is they steal from the best, or they borrow, they're inspired by the best. And, you build something on their platform, and there's always a possibility that one update will totally kill your business. You totally lose everything. And so I think AI, there's areas of AI that you get in, you go hot, and understand that this is not forever, because one update from them, one change from them, one inspiration that they get from what's out there, and suddenly your business is dead. And so I think building your own brand and building your own thing is also super valuable. Or if you're going to build on somebody else's platform or somebody else's technology, understand that could very well be temporary. So, one of the things that you had mentioned was, the flame throwing dog. So what are some things? What are some things that we should be careful about when it comes to AI, when it comes to our brand and podcasting in particular? Because that's what we've been talking about. What are some things that? What are some things that you warn people about when it comes to using AI?
Yeah, I think it's don't get lost in the technology. And you kind of touch base on it there, and the fact that if you build your platform, it's kind of like building your house in the sand. You never know when the tide's going to come up and wash it away. And it's the same way with any technology. So make sure that your brand is at the forefront, and the technology that you're using, it's just the tool for a delivery mechanism. And you have to have a backup in place at all times. And it's just like some of the talks that I give, people go, well, our kids are coming up right now. And traditionally you would go to high school, you'd go to college, you'd pick a career path, you'd get a degree in that career. And now you're a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're a pilot, or whatever it may be. But when our kids today grow up, those aren't going to look anything like they look today. They're not going to look anything like they look today in a year, in 18 months. So we have to have this thought process, and we have to implement this in our brands as well as a continual learning thought process. We have to continually evolve. We have to stay on top of what's changing in the world around us and make sure that we're developing, we're growing, we're learning right along with it. I have a weird personal, what do you call it? Regimen, I guess, every day, right? For some weird reason, and I think as we get older, we wake up early, but I wake up at about 4:30 in the morning. Oh my goodness. Okay. Wow. And you are old. Yeah, it's stupid. It's stupid. I hate it. Yeah. I'm 51. So, as you get older, you wake up earlier. I'll be waking up at 3 here in about 10 years, probably. But I wake up, I brush my teeth, and I grab me a nice fresh Monster, because I love my Monsters. And I sit there because I also sleep on the couch because I got a bad back. So I sit there on the couch and I turn on YouTube, and from about 4:30 to 5:30 or 6, because I do typically fall back to sleep around 6, I'll consume YouTube content. I'll consume all the latest information, all the news on AI, all the news on the latest tools, all the news on whatever I need to be. That's my education time, and it works for me. I know it's not going to work for most people, but that works for me. So we have to find a routine. We have to implement some time for us to develop that continual learning process. And that happens literally, Paul. It happens every day. So Monday through Sunday, I wake up 4:30, do an hour and a half of YouTube, and I just watch the driest, most educational content you could possibly imagine until it drives me back to sleep. So, but that's when I do it. And that's what we have to do. We have to find those times where we can figure out exactly what's going on and how we stay on top of it.
So what are some unexpected ways, because, learning about AI can sometimes feel overwhelming. What are some unexpected ways that AI can be a part? And you shared, with podcasting, you like threw out there, some people are going to have to rewind and re-listen to you threw out a whole bunch of AI options for doing podcasts and things. What are some unexpected ways that AI has impacted branding or podcasting?
And I think from a podcasting perspective, it's just made everything so much easier. AI it's gotten to a point now, and I mentioned Opus Clips earlier, where we could take this video that we're recording right now, run it through Opus Clips, and before you know it, you've got half a dozen reels that you can use that are already captioned, that are ready to go.
I've totally used that.
It's amazing, and it does a tremendous job. Now, granted, it probably produces 20 to 30 reels, and the vast majority are worthless, because it's still not quite there. But dude, if I just upload this and I get half a dozen reels, that's almost a week's worth of content. That's amazing. So it's great, and I don't think people understand the power that's there. We also use, for all of our clients, we use Cast Magic. We run every episode through Cast Magic, and we get show notes, we get transcripts, we get blog posts, we get captions for quote cards, we get everything we could possibly need because Cast Magic has done a tremendous job of using their platform to reproduce all this content for us. It's insane. I think some of the coolest things though, Max Ivy is a friend of mine, and he calls himself the blind blogger. And he is blind. He's sight impaired, and he's a podcaster, and he writes a blog. And AI has completely transformed the way that he does his content. And I think that's been a tremendous benefit for some of the folks that don't have the same opportunities we have, based on, whether they're the physical limitations they may have. And Max has taken AI to the next level for the sight impaired community. And now he's become a speaker in the sight impaired community on AI and how AI has transformed the way he creates his content. So it's just amazing to see these things. And while we see them a lot of times as toys, we go, oh, that's cool. That's cute. I can talk to my phone now. Well, and it gives me a response and blah, blah, blah. But there's serious societal impacts that AI is having that often get overlooked. And I think Max is just one example of what we're going to be seeing going forward, and some of the more empowering features of AI that we tend to overlook from time to time.
I agree. I think that's amazing. And I think even for people that have language, challenges and I mean, there's so many applications that are far beyond just lazy content creation. I think there's so many wonderful applications to AI that we don't even realize, and we're going to continue evolving of how it's used and how it benefits and how it augments what you're already doing. And I think that's powerful. Man, Larry, this has been amazing. Really have enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate you coming on. If people want to learn more about you, how do they find out? How do they get your book? How do they plug into your world?
Yeah, you can just go to my website, LarryRoberts.com. Everything is right there. All my links to my social media, the book, you name it, everything is at LarryRoberts.com.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And so if you were to talk to your younger version of yourself, that little nerd, what would you say to yourself right now?
I'd say, bro, you're never going to be a professional fighter. Focus on making money. That's what I would do. Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, it's been an interesting ride, but it's been fun, man. It's been fun. It's had its ups and downs, but it's been amazing. And I think people today have more of an opportunity than ever to do whatever they want to do. So don't be a slave to the grind. Chase your dreams, chase your brand, chase your message, and deliver that in a format that makes you happy. So just do your thing, man.
That's awesome, man. Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you for joining us on the Headsmack Podcast. We've shared some candid stories and life-changing ideas. And now it's your time to act. First, take bold action on just one idea and see how your life can radically change. Secondly, whatever platform you're listening to this on, please rate it, share it, and leave a comment. Let us know where this episode impacted you. I appreciate you giving me your time, and don't forget to join us for our next Misfit conversation.